Welcome to Conversations of Hope, shining light on the journey of healing from abuse and trauma. I'm Faith Ingraham of Speaking Truth in Love Ministries.
And I'm Michelle Viscuse from Journey Pink. As survivors and advocates, we're here to support, educate, and inspire. Whether you're a survivor of abuse, a friend, family member, or a professional working with survivors, this podcast is for you.
We're breaking the silence that allows abuse to thrive, offering insights for healing and tools for effective support.
Our goal is to create a safe community of understanding, healing, and hope for survivors and their allies.
Visit conversationsofhopepodcast.org for resources and more information. Thank you for joining us on this journey. Welcome to Conversations of Hope again. And today we have a special guest with us. We have Sarah Carr, and she has been with us in our last season. She shared her story, but she has some updates to her story. And we brought her back on so that she could just share with our listeners things that are going on since we last talked to her. So, Sarah, I'm just going to open it up to you and let you share your story and what's been happening.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I appreciate that. It was a great time to come on before, and I'm happy to be here again today. To kind of recap where this all began, so I grew up in a very fundamental evangelical Christian home. My dad was a pastor, one of 4 children, and this would have been the mid-90s when my family shifted gears and got really involved with some of the charismatic movements that were happening. Rodney Howard-Browne down in Lakeland, Florida was one. I think the Vineyard movement happened to be happening at the same time. There were some kind of big shifts happening in that mid-90s timeframe. And our family was kind of part of that. And one of the things that was relevant was this aspect of prophetic words being given and people prophesying around other people and for other people. And, this expectation that there was a way to understand God's will for your life, right? And at the same time, there was also, I think the purpose-driven life was really popular then. Like find your purpose in life. God has a specific purpose and destiny. These are the influences that were going on. My family actually went to Florida for a little bit to be part of that ministry. It was the best summer ever for me as a teenager, but we ended up coming back home because our house didn't sell. So when we came home, we merged. My family started attending a church that a lot of the previous church members that were part of our own home church, my dad's church, had started attending. And this was a church in Owego, New York. And they were early part of Morning Star Ministries, which was down in like the Charlotte, North Carolina area. They were the ones that bought PTL, if you're ever familiar with that complex. So there's a lot of conferences happening down that way, and we were participating in that. But when we came back that summer, I remember this being pretty significant in the sense that the youth pastor at this church was spending a lot of time in my hometown with my family at our family pond, doing different things, spending time with the other youth leaders that were near us in our community, in our neighborhood. And then he's spending a lot of time at my parents' house. Pretty much every day off he was spending at my parents' house, which growing up as a pastor's kid, like that's normal. You have a lot of other ministers and pastors and elders and community members in the house often. But I did notice that this had seemed like it was more and it was recurring and it was really regular. There are a few things here and there that I remember noting comments. I was only 14 years old at the time. So this was mid-90s, 14 years old. So I'm in this stage of life of wanting to do God's will, feeling like God could give me insight and, kind of prophetic awareness around what my destiny, what my purpose is in life. And I certainly think at that age, right, that coming of age, you're wanting to kind of figure out what the future might hold. Boys are part of that. I certainly had my fair share of crushes, but again, we were very, being in the church, purity culture was very strong. So there was an aspect of like no dating. I was not allowed to date. There was also the aspect of, just actually during this time frame, particularly in our youth group, there was also the book I Kid Stating Goodbye by Joshua Harris, which really kind of presented, and I don't think it was just his book, right? I think there was a cultural teaching happening within youth groups that were probably participating in kind of the same curriculum that really perpetuated an idea of courtship, of dating within groups. And when God tells you, or when you feel like someone is going to be your spouse, you court them, which is, I feel like, was like old terminology that probably our grandparents used. But there was this belief system that, you shouldn't be dating a lot of other people. God's going to reveal your spouse, and that's who you're going to end up marrying. And you should do this courtship or betrothal, if you will, and then get married. Like, this was kind of the step, and this was going to keep you pure and safe, and kind of this whole idea. I think being a kid, I just bought into that belief. This makes sense. I didn't question it. Not that I think I could have questioned it, but I did 100% buy into this. So as this pastor is continuing to visit, we've talked about these things. I'm participating in the youth events. This person was also the worship leader and what they would consider to be like a prophetic teacher or prophet. He often gave prophetic words in church situations and to people. It was pretty common to give a person, I have a word of the Lord for you, right? And it always felt like, great, I want this, prophetic word. What is God speaking to you about me? I want to know. And it was in that time frame, after months of him coming to our house regular and participating in this youth group, and me just searching with God, what's my future hold and what should I be doing? I had a dream. This was I'm going to tell it from my experience, and then we'll kind of get into it. But my experience was, I had a dream where this pastor was proposing to me. And I remember waking up and being like, oh my gosh, what is this? This is crazy. And everything in my body was just like, ooh, I don't know. Like, this feels odd. But also because of the cultural context, because there was so much messaging inside the church at the time of, when God calls you, are you going to be ready? Are you going to answer God's call? Are you going to lay down your life for, this calling that God's given you? Will you put down what you want, your way, for God's way? And there was a lot of cultural messaging around that. So I kind of took it like, oh, maybe this is what God is calling me to. I didn't really say anything at first. But within a matter days, weeks, I overheard my mom and this pastor talking and recognized what they were talking about. They were talking about me being his wife down the road. And I caught on to that, and I was like, oh my gosh, I know what you're talking about. And so this kind of unfolded kind of rapidly. And he said, well, yes, I believe I've received a word of the Lord that you are meant to be my wife, that God is giving you to me. And I can't remember the specific context of what his dream or vision was, but I ended up sharing it with my parents. And they were like, okay, and maybe this is God's will for our daughter's life. And I don't think that they had any reason to doubt that this man was untrustworthy. And so we were betrothed, that old-fashioned word of like, okay, betrothed. To me, that meant this is God's will. God's shown you that this is God's will for your life. You're going to marry this person, and we're just going to wait out the appropriate time until we can get married. Again, I was 14 years old at the time, almost 15. So we're talking like, what, 9th, 10th grade of school. I don't think at the time that registered to me as being odd. I think there were moments where I was like, oh, this feels uncomfortable for me. For example, I remember having to tell the boy that I really had a big crush on that I couldn't be his friend anymore. We can't keep talking the way we were because God had revealed that I was supposed to be this man's wife, and the pastor's wife, which in and of itself, that was a wild situation to tell other members in our youth group that I was now being betrothed to the youth pastor. And so I was betrothed, and the church community seemed to go along with it. I had a lot of experiences where I wasn't privy to the conversations that were happening between my parents, his parents, church leaders, Morning Star leaders. So I wasn't part of that conversation. So other than a couple of incidents, which if you do happen to go back and listen, you can listen probably in more detail than what I'll give today. But there was a moment with the youth pastor, or the head pastor's wife, where she had come up to me and had said, "Sarah, you need to be careful about talking about this. People may not really understand what God's doing here, and good people can get hurt." And so it's like, okay, I guess I shouldn't really talk about this too much. I guess I should be careful about who I share this with. There was also another person from Morningstar who had reached out. He was like the head of the prophetic team at the time. And his concern was about my age and maturity level. And I don't remember what I was supposed to take away from that conversation, because at this point in time, right, I was really in this relationship. And David is his name, Pastor Dave. He was already at the point where he was talking to me every day. I had a separate phone line, and he would call me every day to check in, to ask me if I was having any worries, fears, doubts, things like that. And if I did express them, then it became an onslaught of, well, you're just allowing the enemy to come in. Because early on, I did have a couple of moments where I was like, this just doesn't fit right, and I want to get out of this. And one of those times I went to my mom and was like, I don't want to be part of this relationship. Something doesn't feel right. And she was like, good, yep, we'll get you out. And by the time that she managed to like talk to my dad and then kind of go to the elders, I think, Pastor David, got wind of that and then had gotten a hold of me and was like, Sarah, like, this is just the enemy. This is Satan coming to put fear and doubt in your mind. Don't you want to do what God wants you to do? Don't you want to fulfill the will of God for your life? And yeah, 100%, I wanted to fulfill God's will for my life. So I quickly was just like, yeah, all right, this is the enemy. I can be strong. I am a good Christian. I was 100% convinced, and I had no other information to counter that this was God's will for my life, right? This is what God revealed. He said it in a prophetic word and dreams, and other people confirmed it. So this is what God was telling me. This is my destiny, my purpose. And so by the time person from Morningstar had a conversation with me, I was like, there's some concern about my age. I don't know why you're talking to me. Like, there's nothing I can do at this point, right? I think I just listened and was polite. And again, I was like, probably just 15 years old at the time. And so it's like, oh, just moved on. And over time, I think what had happened, what I've been able to piece together, is that I think there were other people in the church that raised the flag, that were like, hey, this feels wrong. And so I think there was some opposition within the church community. And I think that opposition got to be enough that Pastor Dave decided we need to move on. So he had decided to take another position with a traveling ministry, and he left the church. Now, since my story has come out and since there's been conversation in the general church community, I have heard various stories around this via other people that there was opposition, that there were people that were speaking out and saying, like, this doesn't feel right. And I still don't know if the head pastor and the elders called him out on it and said, hey, this isn't okay. We're not okay with it. I don't know if that ever happened. That information never got to me. What I do know is that he decided to leave the church. I also know that they blessed him. There's a whole prayer meeting like, oh, we're blessing and we're moving. We're sending him out on his way to this new ministry. And so he left to go to this ministry. In the meantime, our family left the church. My parents attended another church locally. I think my sibling probably still attended various youth groups kind of all over. But what I remember happening is being told, like, I shouldn't go to youth group anymore. I wasn't going to church. He'd also managed to convince my parents not to send me back to public school for 10th grade. And it was for my safety. So 10th, 11th, 12th, I actually was homeschooled through that whole period and graduated early in order to get through. I think there had been a condition that he couldn't marry me until I was a graduate, right? So I think he was pushing me toward getting through my education as quickly as possible, which I did. So I spent, from the time I was pretty much 15 to 17, 2-year period, pretty much isolated. I was like absent. I didn't go to youth group. I didn't go to church. If he ministered somewhere, I went with him. We always had parents with us when we went anywhere publicly. But we had a lot of alone time and eventually got engaged. Wedding was set for just after I turned 17. So I was like 17 years old, I think, when the wedding date we went down and got courthouse paperwork signed and was ready to get married. And then our wedding was scheduled for June 12th. So shortly thereafter. And right before the wedding, days before the wedding, he got sick with pancreatitis. And when he got sick, he got hospitalized. We postponed the wedding. And then he spent months that summer in the hospital with different surgeries and kind of trying to get on top of this major infection. And I'm not exactly sure what happened or what changed in that time frame, but I happened to be up in Syracuse at the Syracuse University Hospital with him right after major surgery. And there had been a phone conversation between his parents were there in the hospital room with me and him, and conversation with, I think, his uncle. And it just happened to be something around food or something to do with make sure, when you are married that you cook well for him kind of thing, and healthy meals, and make sure you follow doctor's instructions for that. And I was like, yeah, absolutely, I will. Something about that really offended his mom, and she got really mad at me. And I know she pushed me down. I don't really remember all the pieces of it, except that I remember the nurse coming in and pushing them aside and saying, get away from her. And then she grabbed me and took me out. And we went for a little walk, sat down on a park bench outside the hospital. And she just said, Sarah, she goes, I don't know what's going on. But I just need you to know that you have choices, that you don't have to do anything you don't want to do. And she sat with me until I kind of regained composure and was able to breathe. And I went back in and I was like, I called my dad and I need you to come get me. I need to come home. And he did. And that was the last time that I really spoke to David or his family, really. When I went home, the hospital informed me that he had invoked HIPAA. And so I was no longer able to call and check in. And so this whole time I'm engaged to him, I'm still his fiance, but because we weren't legally married, I still had no rights. And he was in the hospital a bit longer. And then eventually was discharged. When he was discharged, he called me to tell me that while he was in the hospital, that an angel of the Lord had appeared to him and told him not to marry me, that I would ruin his ministry. I was unworthy, basically, and that I would ruin his ministry. So that was the end of the relationship. The relationship ended. He came and got the stuff from the house that we were going to move into together. And I saw him one other time in person to try to have a conversation of hey, did closure. I remember asking, did you love me? Did you ever love me? He's like, I did, I don't now. And then he kind of tried to hook me up with other people. He's like, just go live your life, burn everything I ever gave you. Just cut off all contact, cut off all contact. Don't talk to me. Don't think about me, that kind of thing. And I didn't until, and I really just buried everything. The good news is that I didn't marry him, right? That ended. The bad news is that pretty much right from day one of that relationship, he was sexually abusing me. And so in that moment when God said that you will ruin my ministry and that we're not to get married. And the whole time I kept thinking, and I can even remember feeling this right up before the wedding, I felt so much guilt and shame for what we were doing because I fully believed, right, that it was my responsibility to maintain our boundaries, to maintain that purity before marriage, to not engage in anything sexually related. And so in that moment when it felt as if God was saying, you are no longer worthy, it felt like God's judgment. It felt like I had failed God. All right.
It's okay. Take a minute.
So yeah, I didn't disclose to anyone what had happened between us. I didn't talk about any of the sexual abuse. Even at the time, I didn't name it as abuse because I fully felt like it was my responsibility. I had failed to remain pure before God. And so I just picked up the pieces and moved on and was like, I'll just be a good girl. Just try to earn love and favor back. And I did that for a long time. And it really wasn't until, well, Luke is 13. My son is 13. So it would have been probably 10 years ago that I had finally come to a place in my life. Like, I just had moved that story so far away from me, like just buried it and just walked away until like 10 years ago. And I recognized probably for the first time ever that I was like, oh, that thing that happened to me, that was probably not God's will for my life, right? And the whole idea of me marrying him was probably not God's will. And then it was like a huge revelation of, wait, that whole experience was predatory, right? I was able to put it in a framework of a 26-year-old man targeting a 14-year-old child. How does that happen, right? Like that, like to me in my adult mind was finally able to say that was wrong, that was predatory, that was abuse, right? So I had this moment of like, oh my gosh. And then I was like, let me go do some therapy around this a little bit. And I was determined at that point in time just to let it be my story inside. I'll heal. I'll just handle this. I think I disclosed a little bit to my parents at the time, but not really very many other people. I really just kind of was like, I'll just heal. This can be a private thing. And then I happened to watch a documentary, Abducted in Plain Sight, with Jan Borgen, and noticed a lot of themes in her story. And the one thing is at the end of the story, because I think in my head, there was part of me that was like, he wanted to marry me. I don't know how I twisted that in my head, but I was convinced that probably he wasn't ever going to target anybody else because it was just in this framework of wanting to be married. And then I knew he had been married, so I assumed he's married now, so it's all good probably now for him. But watching that documentary, a couple of things I noticed, like one, the grooming of family, right? I was like, oh my gosh, I'm seeing this and recognizing some of these patterns. And I really noticed that this man in Jan's story was a man of God. He was a family man. He was married. He had wanted to marry Jan. And yet he went on to not only abuse her, but so many other people. And that came out in the end. And I had a visceral reaction to that. And I was like, oh my gosh, what if? Like, because I was just seeing those patterns and somehow it clicked that this kind of predatory behavior doesn't typically just happen once and then move on. It typically tends to be a pattern in people unless they're stopped. Like, it continues. And so that's when I made a decision of like, I need to report this. Like, in fact, I remember calling my sister and being like absolutely devastated and be like, oh my God, like what if he's harmed other people and I've been silent for 20 years at this point? Like, what do I do? Thank God she was such a compassionate person. And she's like, Sarah, she's like, that's not your fault. Like that is not on you. And you gotta let that go. If you want to report, go ahead and report. But like 100%, that's not you. So I did go through the process of reporting. I thought that I would just be reporting for the sake of having like a paper trail, right? So if anybody else ever came forward, there'd be corroboration to their story, that kind of thing. And I had to report in 2 states because he lived in New York State, I lived in Pennsylvania, and abuse happened in both states, his house and my parents' house. So I went through the whole process of reporting to Pennsylvania State Police, and I was not prepared. That was the first time. And I will warn anybody listening to the story that ever thinks about reporting to police, please know that you have the right to an advocate first, and go seek out through your county or other like abuse and rape crisis centers, find an advocate first to kind of go through your story with them, and then kind of go to the police and have that advocate with you. Because I didn't, and it was the first time I ever told my story. Which presented some legal issues down the road. But I told that story the first time ever in detail, graphic detail, because that's what they need when they're looking at criminal situations. And in Pennsylvania, it is a criminal. Like, what happened to me was still criminal and still prosecutable. And I didn't know that at the time. The statute of limitations had shifted, in the state of Pennsylvania and had been extended. So when he looked at me and said, hey, do you do you want us to pursue this? I was like, I don't know what you mean. He lives in Australia. Have been living there for years. I don't know how you can prosecute this. And he's like, okay, let me put it this way. If he lived here in this town, he goes, would you want us to go arrest him? And I was like, oh my God, yeah, hands down. I'd want you to go arrest him. Absolutely. He's like, okay, that's all I know. And then he went and then took that. And they're like, we're going to, check in with the DA's office and then pursue it from there. When I reported to New York State statute of limitations had expired for the particular things that had happened to me. And there was no recourse in New York State, but still had the paper trail. And then it took a life of its own on the legal side because the DA didn't, it's very hard. I've learned that it's very hard. It's not an easy legal journey to have a case that is so old. There's some risks involved in prosecuting something like that. So the DA needed to do a lot of research around kind of statute of limitations and, what that would look like. Plus there was the aspect of extradition. And so it kind of floated around with one of the DAs. He was retiring. A new DA was coming in. The new DA came in. That DA was later charged with sexual abuse. Some of his clients. And so he was taken out. It is interesting because I remember meeting with him. And this time I had an advocate with me, thank God. I was never left alone with this man. But when I talked about the case and what could we do, he was absolutely going to kill the case. He was like, no, this is going to be, he said, she said, it's not prosecutable. Like, no. He was like a hard no. They got the advocate with me at the time, but like, wait. She's like, if we could get, and she came up with another strategy. If you had evidence, if you had a recording, like, could we pursue this? And he was like, yeah, it was just enough to buy time. So she's like, okay, well, let's pursue this a little bit further. And then next thing you know, he's out of that position anyway. And then the new DA, so this is like playing out over years, and then the new DA came in and was looking at some things, ended up having a conversation with a representative from the Pennsylvania Attorney General's office. And Pennsylvania Attorney General's office said, yes, let's send me the case file. I'll take a look at this. And finally, I think it was, I want to say this was probably like year 4 from the time of reporting. I ended up meeting with them and they said, yeah, we're going to pursue this. And they finished the investigation. They investigated and questioned as many people as I could give them, as far as people that maybe I had talked to, people that were aware of the relationship, that kind of thing. And then charges were filed in, I guess it would have been April 2023, charges were filed. And then there's the whole extradition process, which is the whole thing. So on his way to the Philippines, he was detained because of the Interpol notice. He was then sent to LA County Jail and then extradited from LA County Jail to Pennsylvania. And that happened last April. So almost a year from the time that charges were filed to the time that he was brought back here. And then last year was quite a year. I think that's kind of where we started connecting and having a conversation about what was happening. I think the last time we talked, I had just gone through the prelim trial. And the prelim trial was a year ago today, actually. The first time I had ever faced him in court, and the first time that we had to go through the process of detailing what the charges were. My story was cross-examined. The good news, and I will say that was probably one of the most horrific experiences of my life, like going through the prelim trial. It was just really difficult. But I made it through, and all charges were kept and moved forward in the system. So then a criminal trial was scheduled for that fall. And just like with any legal thing, there's still more things to have happen. And it kind of went through another leg of journey. I got reassigned to yet another DA, or I guess this is Attorney General's office representative. I think it got pushed back from the original court date, paperwork, and not being ready, I think, for trial. And then January, I think, was when we were scheduled for the next date. So trial was set for January. And I remember we were just right, like we were in trial prep. Like trial prep was supposed to be the next day. And then the next week was supposed to be the trial. And I got the call, I think the day of, like I was going to go into trial prep. And I got the call that said, hey, we reached a plea deal. And I had known a little bit about some of the parameters of what might be available in the plea deal. And I have to say I was completely relieved because the whole idea of going through a trial was I would have 100% done it, but it was overwhelming. It was a little bit scary to think about, relying on having a jury, and you never know what a jury might decide or how they might interpret things. So the plea deal was reached, and then we had a plea sentencing scheduled, I think in February, or I guess is a plea hearing is the correct term, scheduled for February. And went to that, which I have to say was like an incredible experience. I had friends and advocate family all there. And it was fun to the point because we had quite a group with us. And my advocate, actually I had a couple advocates, and then the attorney was like, this is just a plea hearing, right? Like this isn't like sentencing. I'm like, no, I know. But we really wanted to hear him say, yes, I did this, right? Because that was incredibly validating. There was something to that, to knowing that he was taking ownership of, yes, I did this. Whether that was, in order to get out of less time, I don't care. I don't care if that was his motive. I don't care what his motivation was for pleading. Hearing him say in a court of law that, yes, I did this was really powerful. And then we had a sentence hearing, which was hard because I had to write my victim impact statement, and no one ever preps you, right? There's no life course that you don't practice ever writing a victim impact statement. Although sometimes I think maybe in a therapeutic process that might be beneficial. I had to write a victim impact statement, and so I sat with that for a long time to write that and then get that submitted, and then I had to read that, and I'm grateful for that experience. It was just really hard. The judge listened to that. He was in the courtroom that day, and he had to listen to that as well. I got my moment to say, this is how this has all affected me. This is how this has impacted my life. This is what I carry. And I've carried this shame and I've carried this guilt for so long. And now I want to put this where it rightfully belongs, which is here with the defendant, the perpetrator. This is not mine to carry anymore. And the judge was absolutely amazing. I will say, and the plea that was reached, they did consult me on it. I agreed with the philosophy behind it. So when they were working on the plea deal, the attorney that was working on it had said, one of the things that I prefer to do in a situation like this is to have a longer probationary period versus a longer sentencing. So if we can do a shorter sentence period, but the longer probation, I think that provides a little bit more accountability. And I did agree with that. So the plea deal that was reached was a 3 to 6 year time served with, I think it's 8 years of probation. So 3 to 6 years confinement or sentencing to jail, 8 years of probation, and then a lifetime registration as a sex offender. So that felt good. That felt like a victory in a sense of there's accountability pretty much for the rest of his life, right?
Mm-hmm.
Some aspect. That's how this all has ended. It's kind of come to this kind of closure of there's been accountability. He's serving time, and yeah, it took 6 years to get here, but we got here.
Wow. Right, yeah. That's an incredible story. And the thing that hits me is you, like most victims, felt like you were responsible for his abusing you. You felt like you didn't set the right boundaries and you didn't do this. And that was a lot because of the way that he groomed you, and he used spiritual abuse as well to make you feel like this is God's will, and if you do something that makes it not God's will. It's all on you.
Yeah.
Nothing's on him.
Right.
And that, I mean, it's so sad because so many victims do feel like it's their fault and there's nothing that they can do. And then they're dealing with all of the stuff, plus the trauma,
Mm-hmm.
plus the abuse. And it's like, it's just compounds.
Yeah.
And then people will just say, like, even the whole legal process, people will say, well, why don't you just, that's a whole long process in itself. And there's a lot of trauma around that as well. And so nothing is easy, even though you finally feel like there's some justice, it's not an easy road and you're still traumatized over and over again.
100%. Yeah. There were so many points along the way, right, that were traumatizing. Particularly the prelim trial for me was extremely traumatizing. As much as someone can be grounded and prepared, experiencing having to detail story in a courtroom with people that you don't know, in that setting, and not feeling safe and secure, and then experiencing a memory that hasn't been processed before, right? It was traumatizing. Hearing what people, when it comes into a public format, I don't know that I have words to articulate what that experience is of having something so personal, something that you've experienced, public information, right? And honestly, there's part of this that I'm still wrestling with. I kind of thought it was normal for charging documents to always be public information. They're not apparently always normal. I'm not sure why my charging documents were made public. But they were, and they were shared and they were talked about, and right, there's that detail is out there. And while I understand partly why, like in the court system, it also feels like, part of my story, private part of my story is just out there, without my consent. Anyway, that's a piece that is really hard sometimes too. And then it's open to people commentary, right?
Right.
And while most people have been gracious, and there's been so much support and so many comments that have said, Sarah, you're so brave. I appreciate you doing this, right? Like, there's also comments that, my grandparents at one point had said, why are you doing this? You're going to bring shame to the church. There are other people that had made comments like, he's a good family man. He's a good Christian man. And, the aspect that people think that, someone, just because they do some good thing, that they get a free pass, right? That there shouldn't be accountability. You find yourself in a whole world of difficult conversations and people that don't know how to respond to the church scenario, right? Like, that still doesn't feel fully resolved. While having this out there and be and in such public, the church, there have been folks that I had gone to church with that have reached out, right? But the church institution itself, right, and Morningstar itself has never acknowledged any harm, any responsibility, any culpability, any piece of that. It's still been deny, and distance, right?
Mm-hmm. Right. And we've talked about grooming on several of our episodes, but in your case, there's grooming that happened within the church, with it, and grooming your family. Did your parents recognize that they were groomed in this process, and you were groomed? And
Yeah, I don't think until a lot later. I think it took a while for them to recognize it. And it's funny that you mention it, because I think that there's still quite a few people that question, like, were your parents really groomed? And when we say that, what I mean is that if you're spending time at my family's house, right, continually being there, being present in a way to say, I am trustworthy, I am a man of God. And in church culture, particularly where there is purity culture, the expectation is that he would 100% would never touch me, right? I think I can say for my parent, I can say 100%. I know that my parents believed probably too much though. Like they didn't notice any signs. There were probably signs that they should have been aware of, but they believed so fully that he was an honorable, trustworthy man of God, that he wouldn't have crossed any boundaries with me. He would have never touched me. I think that they fully believe that. And therefore, that's where the grooming came in, is that he presented himself that way through the whole relationship too, right? Like, and then I think he groomed the church, right? I think there was an aspect of like, I am a man of God. I am trustworthy. I received these words and visions. They should be listened to and respected. But there was a lot of grooming that went on. And then certainly with me, right? Like, I would say there's probably a level of brainwashing that happened more so than even grooming. He isolated me. Number one, I had no contact. Remember, there's no outside source other than my parents. So everything that he was saying to me, there was no checks and balances. There was never a space to be like, hey, this might not be okay. I didn't have anyone to talk to. I didn't have anyone to question anything with. I don't know that I would have, because he had already like established that if I questioned anything that was contrary to, this line of thinking that this was 100% God's will for my life, then I was the one that was weak or not following God. And even with the sexual abuse, right, there's the phrasing of, we're already married in God. So everything that I understood about being a good wife is submitting to my husband, is giving him what he wants. So if he's asking me to do things that I'm uncomfortable with, it's my duty as a good Christian woman, as a good Christian wife, this was, again, my conditioning, was to fulfill that, was to be that for him. And so, 100% groomed and brainwashed.
And he's working in ministry, like he's working with youth. So the thought is, this man is trustworthy. Yeah. Otherwise, we wouldn't have him as a youth pastor.
Right.
So there's already this notion that because he is presenting as safe and trustworthy, and then he does all the extra grooming and shows up and he's there and he love bombs, I assume. And, makes everything seem like he's just great.
Yep.
And the door opens.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And the thing is, it's dangerous when anybody sets themselves up as God's authority to you.
Yeah.
Even a pastor in a pulpit, if they say, I'm the final authority, it's like, no, I can go right to God and find out, is this what God's telling me? And I think, especially with your age, you were taught to be submissive to those in authority, to listen to the pastoral leaders, the church leaders, and you were just set up. And then the people that were supposed to know and set the boundaries to protect you weren't doing that either. They weren't saying, this is a little off. So, and even when they were saying that they did hear this is off, they still didn't pursue it to the extent that they should have and said, hey, we're not going to go along with this. We're going to put a stop to it.
Yeah.
So you were, I guess, let down by, it wasn't just him. It was like the whole church culture, and your parents, even though they had bought in to his rhetoric, so to speak. And I know that they feel bad about that now, looking back. It's easy to look back and say, how could we have been so stupid? How could we have not seen the signs? But when you really trust somebody and you think that they have your best interest and your child's best interest at heart, you can just get carried away in the whole situation. But your story is good because it tells other families what they need to be aware of and how they need to be on guard.
Right. Yeah. Because the thing is, they are master manipulators.
Mm-hmm.
masters at it. That's how they get away with it. They manipulate everybody.
Yeah. And I'm sure if your parents started questioning him, he would have come back with, well, how can you question me? You know that because he's already been spinning that.
Yeah. Yeah.
And he
with them.
probably set it up before they could even ask, where he constantly would say things about purity or how important it is that
Yeah.
they're master.
They are masterful. And I think he was masterful, 100%. And to that point, and even know that there were moments, right, where, in the church, when someone would speak up and say, hey, this doesn't feel right to me, he had already been to my parents to discredit this person, with a very good, this person, right, is jealous, or this person is, coming after me, right, because of this. He had an excuse preemptively for absolutely everything. And so, he was all about that.
And always a step ahead.
Always
a step ahead. That's the hard part for people to understand sometimes, but they're always a step ahead. And Sarah, when you paused there in the minute of, sharing, we wanted to honor you and give you that space. But I do want to say to you that I'm so sorry this happened to you, and that God loves you, and this never was your fault, ever. And that the fact that you have taken so many brave steps, the reporting, and when you showed up, for most people, like reporting and getting the kind of response that you got, that would be enough to say, you know what, forget it. I'm not going to do this. But you kept doing it. And then when the DA said, this isn't going to work, we're not going to pursue this.
Yeah.
And you kept pursuing it.
Yeah.
So I just commend you for walking a path that is incredibly difficult, that most people will never get the chance to walk. And if they do, they're probably going to experience so much hardship and, pushback, but you decide, I'm not going to pursue this. But you didn't, and you kept pursuing it, and you kept standing up. Even with your story being out there, even with that day that you said the preliminary, how awful it was, you kept showing up. And I just want to commend you for your bravery and your courage, and even for being here with us today. But I think for the listeners, there's, a lot of people have gone through similar things of what you've experienced. And I think it's important for them to know this is not your fault. God loves you. And the fact that the spiritual abuse is wrapped all up in this is so damaging and it's so unfortunate. And people just may not even realize the impact that the spiritual abuse has.
Yeah. To that, I still, even through this whole journey, right, I still hold that the spiritual abuse piece of that is harder to recover from than the sexual abuse, because it's getting at your innate sense of worth, right? When someone puts themselves in the position and the spokesperson of being God, such sacred space, and says you are unworthy, right? That is, I don't know that there's any other more damaging to say than the God, creation, God, source, love, the ultimate beyond anything physical is telling you that you're unworthy. It's like harm like no other harm. I think there should be special.
Right.
Yeah, and it's funny because that's not prosecutable. You don't get to hold anybody accountable for that. And that's where I think there's a call to churches, spiritual leaders and faith leaders to get better at this.
Yes.
No one has a right to tell another person. Jesus never gave anyone authority to tell another person that they are unworthy. That's not what Jesus ever came to do, was to condemn anyone. And personally, that's where I'm like, no one should have that right to say to another person where they stand with God, right?
Right.
Yeah.
And then,
Yeah.
go ahead.
And he put all of that he actually added all of that stuff onto you that he had to break off because you would damage his ministry, not that he already damaged his ministry because he was abusive.
Yeah.
And and brainwashing and all of that stuff. It's really incredible how predators and abusers blame the victim. They are great at victim blaming. It's all your fault. It's all on you. And then you already as a victim are self-blaming as well. And it's just, I guess it's maddening. You get so angry that somebody could abuse somebody and then on top of it, put all the blame back on them. But it happens so often. But in your case, it's even more sad because of the spiritual aspect of it. He brought God into it and was acting like God is condemning you because you couldn't fulfill what this man wanted you to fulfill.
Yeah.
And I just feel I am really sorry for what you went through because it's horrific. And even the fact that at that time, you were like 17 years old then when he's telling you this, and you didn't have anyone that you could go to and say, this is how I'm feeling.
Yeah.
And anybody that could reinforce your worth and build you up and let you know that it wasn't your fault and God was actually protecting you from having to go into this relationship with this abusive man because he was already showing signs that he was going to be very abusive by isolating you and by already brainwashing you and gaslighting you and all of that stuff. So God was protecting you, but then you felt like you were a failure. And instead of feeling that was God's protection, you felt, oh, God's punishing me. And that's, I just feel so sad that you had to go so many years feeling that shame and that doubt that God cared about you.
Thank
Yes.
you.
A lot of survivors carry that shame and guilt, but to have the spiritual aspect intertwined, it's horrific.
Yeah.
And the fact that at that age, at 14, you're building an emotional attachment to someone that has appeared as if God has ordained this attachment. And then all of a sudden, one day, when I'm assuming, getting wind that things aren't going to go the way he planned, he just drops it. And you're left holding that with no support, with no understanding of how did we get from here. And even though I know you said like you just kind of pushed it away, but that's that's all you had known. Think of like I just look back at experiences that teenagers have and what they get to do, go to proms, go to all these things, do teenager things. And you missed that all because he had you laser focused on this is what you have to do. And this is how we're going to make it happen.
Yep. Yeah. Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
But
you are a brave, strong warrior. And the fact that you have taken all of those steps and you did it to prevent others from experiencing and so that others could come forward if needed, et cetera, and to prevent it from happening again.
Yeah. Yeah. I will say, like, it's only been a couple months since the sentencing, and it does have that feel of like, I did something here. This is like permanent record, right? Like this is case history. This is a success story. All of the odds that were stacked against this case, like it still happens. And I was part of that, right? I was part of actively pursuing and ensuring that kind of happens. And I didn't give up. And there was one time in particular, I remember and it was after the preliminary hearing, and we were in between attorneys, and I was 100% convinced I couldn't do it anymore. And I was like, I can't do this anymore. This is just too much, and I can't face it. And just I think a few other attorneys and advocates kind of were able to hold some space for me and give me some time to recuperate, and then kind of get back up and continue moving forward. But it is a hard journey, and I am grateful. I hope, these conversations didn't happen 20 years ago. These things weren't being talked about. Culture was still accepting that this was just part of life, and that you suck it up and you just move on. And now there is accountability, and there's case history, and there's precedent for these types of abuses being held accountable, right? And there's a pathway towards justice, and it doesn't undo what happened at all, but it gives that space for me to reclaim some of my power, my voice, to put the responsibility where it should be.
That's right.
Which is with him, not with me.
That's right.
And what would you say about the purity culture and the courtship culture to caution people so that their young daughters or young sons aren't coerced
Yes.
into doing something that they don't feel is right for them?
Yeah.
I think that's a danger that we have, because we want to do what's good for our kids. And sometimes we coerce them
Mhm.
or make them feel like they have no choice in the way that their life is lived.
Yeah. I think consent is a huge piece to that, right? I think instead of teaching purity in the sense of you have to remain pure before marriage, and anything that isn't, right, is, I wish we could change I don't know if this is the same for everybody that grew up in purity culture. I know it would for me and many of my friends, that it felt like any kind of sexual sin, put it in quotes though, sin, was the worst kind of sin that there could ever be. Almost to the point that is irredeemable. And I remember like hearing sermons of like, girls, if you do these things, right, you're like chewed up gum, or you're a flower that no longer has petals. Like, the framing that purity culture put around it was so damaging that like you can never be the same. And I know that's how I took that on and was like, this is the worst of the worst. I am never ever going to be the same. There's even believing in a redeeming God, this was unredeemable. This was life changing, right? And I think instead of teaching that, and I think we need to teach consent, and we need to teach, that it's okay to say no to something, to even someone that's in authority, to be able to teach that this isn't the worst thing, right? Like, I know that we talked before. I think, Michelle, maybe you shared some of your story, but you did too. Like, there was no language for abuse. Abuse wasn't talked about. And I think we have to have conversations about what does that look like when someone, asking you to do something that you're not comfortable with. How do you say no to that? How do you have a boundary instead of being obedient or submissive, and kind of those words that we tend to honor in Christian culture?
Right.
We need to provide the nuance, right? It's not black and white. It's not all the time. It is an aspect of building safety within relationship with another. It's how do you build trust with another human being, and that they have your best interest at heart. And yeah, I actually don't have all the answers for how to,
Right.
like, I feel like there's so much to it.
Yeah.
It has to be untangled.
Right. And I think too, there's a different standard for girls and boys
There is.
in the purity culture. A girl is used in, like you said, she chewed up bubble gum. But a boy, do they say that about a boy that has been, whether it was abuse or whether they willingly, but it's like it's different. And the girls were made to feel responsible if the boy sinned. It was their fault because they tempted him, or whatever.
The temptation aspect, right? Like everything from the way that you dress to the way that you walk, maybe the way you style your hair, or, all of these things. I can remember growing up in that culture and being very aware. I mean, I wore a lot of baggy clothes didn't save me. I wore baggy clothes all through the 90s. That didn't save me. It wasn't what I was wearing. But we put the responsibility on women and girls more than we do men. There is an assumption that men cannot control their thoughts, right? And their desires, and they're like kind of like wild animals or something. And I mean, I know that I've even heard teachings within the church about, that craving is God-given, and, women are there to serve that. And so, yeah, I think we have to shift that narrative that it is not on us. And I think parents need to teach that boys are and men are capable of not responding to every thought that comes into their head, right? And exercising control and consent and respect for women.
And we're talking about it more with abuse and stuff. And yes, there are paths now that we can take. And I think people healing is going to help future generations to have their voice and to know about consent. But I still think the church has a lot to do in terms of accountability and exposure, and making sure that the people that they put in positions to lead are not being predators. And if they are, that they address it, not just let it happen.
Yeah. There's a situation I know of right now that a known predator, right, of a church in Kansas City, Mike Bickle and IHOP Kesey, Morning Star is wanting to put him back into ministry right now. And you just think, what's the thought process here? Why are we platforming known abusers?
Right. Would you put a treasurer that embezzled money back in that position?
Right.
And that they're in charge of money, not children and not vulnerable adults. And so if you're more concerned about the money aspect than the people aspect, when somebody violates a trust, they should not be put back into a position of trust. And that's maddening to me as well. God can forgive, but there are consequences. Right. And part of those consequences are that you've lost your position of trust. Yep. We're not going to trust you in this position anymore.
And while we know that, churches haven't always responded appropriately or done the right thing in these situations, we also know that there are many listeners who have experienced sexual abuse and spiritual abuse at the hands of people who represented God or said that they represented God. And so what would you say to those listeners who haven't been through the journey that you've been through of healing, and who hasn't had maybe that revelation yet, that wait a minute?
Yeah, I think that's an excellent question. I don't know that I have the words to articulate what I would want to say. I think there's an aspect of wanting to give back sovereignty and autonomy in your relationship to God, and knowing that nobody else gets to step in and say what your worthiness is, what your relationship to God is. Nobody else gets to do that. Sacred space, that's yours. That's yours alone. Nobody has authority to speak into that in any way, shape, or form. I think I would start there. And I know that that's hard, because the conditioning sometimes is so great around that. I would also say that you're not alone. Survivors that have experienced this, you're not alone in this. That there are resources, that it's a journey to reclaim that autonomy. It's a journey to reclaim your relationship to God. That's a journey. And it can take however long. It can be messy. It can take years, decades. But as long as you're in it, it's a journey, and you're making progress. And yeah, and there's hope and resources. I would say too that this day and age, there are so many more resources available than ever been before. So
Yes. And just like you mentioned watching that movie and how that movie opened up your eyes to the reality of abuse, I hope for the listeners too, just being able to hear you share your experience and share your story, that it opens the pathway for them to pursue healing for their abuse and their spiritual abuse. Thank you so much.
Huge.
Yeah. Thank you so much for being on here with us today and for sharing your story. And we know it's been very difficult and a hard process. And like you said, it is a journey, but your journey has been very difficult. And I know that it's going to be inspiring to other people who have gone through similar situations. And we just thank you for your willingness to come on here and share your story and insights with us.
Yes. Sarah, you are beautiful. You are brave. You are courageous. Thank you for taking the steps that you needed to take to pursue justice and to get healing.
Yeah. Thank you both for the work that you're doing and spreading these stories and giving hope and helping survivors, and not just survivors, but like the general public too. You're doing so much in the advocacy space and education space and providing resources for people in this journey. Surviving in and of itself is brave, and you're giving that to people that have been harmed, and you're giving them hope. So thank you.
Thank you.
We hope this episode of Conversations of Hope has been a source of comfort and inspiration.
Remember, you are not alone on this journey of healing.
Visit conversationsofhopepodcast.org for more resources and information.
Please subscribe or follow and share with those who might need this message of hope. Until next time, keep hope alive.